Alright, so I always say I'll make these a little shorter, and then they always end up not being a little shorter. And today's topic, I will do my best to also add in the necessary visual component, because it's about art today. It's about the visual arts today. It's something I've wanted to write about for a while. I've suggested some of my pieces, and I do think it requires a sort of longer, extended, annotated essay. But today, I just want to touch upon it. Now, I guess by this point, it's roughly 3 years ago, I was given the opportunity at my school to teach some electives in the afternoon, and this would have been like the entire afternoon block. So with the break, almost about 3 hours once a week, and this class was art appreciation. I had basically pitched art appreciation. There would be little to almost no homework. The final would be very simple. But what I wanted to do was something I myself would have wanted to have learned in high school. Namely, I didn't want to give a typical chronological art history class, and then we could look at some art. I wanted it almost exclusively to be about visual arts, encountering these visual arts. And while I'd move through it chronologically, I wanted to think about particular broad genre. And so the first semester was all about portraiture. And to be frank, when I think of a lot of art in the form of portraits, that tends not to be my favorite. We all think of the portraits we see at art museums or history museums, and you think of the stuffy Renaissance to early modern figure. You almost can hear him speak through the frame in a voice like this. Oh, Jacob, it's taken a little too long to establish my visage. I knew there had to be more to portraiture than that. And I knew I'd seen a lot of paintings and sculpture which were so much more interesting than that stereotype. However, I wasn't sure how to begin, because I noticed something really interesting. The oldest paintings we know about, and while portraiture, as I'll mention again, probably too many times, is not simply confined to two-dimensional art, most of us, for good reason, think of painting in particular when we think of portraiture. But the Chauvet Cave in France, for instance, the oldest paintings that we know of that are still surviving, those paintings, none of them show human beings. None of them show anthropomorphic figures. None of them show gods. They're all animals. They're incredible works of art. The mystery and the spiritual caliber animating them is fascinating, but there are no depictions of human beings. And as I was getting together all the works of art I was going to project and talk about, I learned something fascinating. We only have portraiture as human beings because of death. Now, that might be a very odd statement, but I think I can make the case pretty easily. The first portraits, as far as we can tell, come from modern-day Lebanon, essentially. And they are skulls which were buried and encased in plaster. And before moving on, let's just make sure we have a very basic understanding of art, especially when we're thinking of art purely in the visual sense. First, all art is artificial. It's made by human beings. Essentially, you take the products of nature and you fashion them yourself. Sometimes it's as simple as, like the Chauvet Cave, you get some ashes, maybe you get something off a bush that looks like a brush, and you paint something on a wall. Other times, you go through a huge amount of steps and gradations and work with tools to get you the tools to make the art. But art, first and foremost, is always man-made. It's always literally artificial. But the second thing, and this is going to be the part of the definition that's a bit more controversial, and frankly, let's just work with it. You can disagree all you want, but essentially, art are objects whose value is intrinsic to themselves. In other words, they're not tools meant to make other things. Okay, maybe they aid you in the spiritual life, quite literally. And, of course, you can design plates, which are ultimately art objects you don't use, but still they're plates. Without getting further, that's the basic place I'm going to land. Art is artificial, it's man-made, and second, the art object is intrinsic to itself. It's not a tool in the normal sense. It's not a technology in the normal sense. So we have skulls encased in plaster. Funeral art. And literally depicting the likeness of the person. I mean, again, I'm not saying there was painting on them, but you're taking their actual skull and you're just slightly altering it, forgive me, to turn it into an art object. Okay, very nice. Now, the question I had for myself was, is this what I'm going to find when I go to the next bit of portraits they've uncovered? Will it all be funerary art? And for the most part, yeah, absolutely. It was all going to be funeral art. Eventually, it stops. But the first portraits are all three-dimensional. They're all sculpted in some way. And they're all funerary art. A great example are these stone-carved sarcophagi from the Etruscans in Italy. I mean, there's a beautiful one, and I'll show a picture of it here, of this couple, and they're filled with joy and life and light, and obviously they're idealized here, but they don't get a portrait of themselves until they're passed on. We can assume they commissioned it while they were still living, but literally it was for their burial. And you see other three-dimensional objects like this. Then you go to Egypt, and of course the sarcophagi of the mummy are all portraits, idealized, but you get the portrait when you die. And then you even get to painting proper, two-dimensional painting. And you start to notice that the portraits, the first portraits ever we get in the Western world, as in two-dimensional portraits, painted portraits, are the Roman mummy portraits. These are amazing. They are portraits of a not as idealized fashion, I would say. They're not ugly, but they're clearly not really trying to make these people look like gods and goddesses. They're painted directly onto the sarcophagus. And they look like people you've met. They look like people you could talk to. They are not so highly skilled as to appear like the artwork of Renaissance masters, but they're not so rough that it seems like they're depicting people of an ancient lineage that you could never associate with. The gap would be too wide. You look at these people and they remind you of people you know. They're very haunting. I just think they're beautiful. I love them. But you're noticing a pattern. All portraits of human beings, you only get them when they die. Now this obviously changes. But even when it changes, there appears to be this interesting caveat. So the Romans seem to be the first to really have portraits of human beings, and not just gods and not just royalty. Like I just mentioned, these are Roman Egypt mummy portraits. But in Rome proper, before it was painting, it was again the three-dimensional, and it was usually funerary. But then patricians started to commission portraits of themselves, and what's so funny is these portraits of themselves, they tended to still be holding these likenesses of their passed on ancestors. These literal masks of the dead. They're holding them in this portrait of themselves. It's almost as if they know they have to seek permission from the dead to have a portrait done of themselves. And then we get into weirdism or verism, which is an early form of realism. And specifically, you create a bust or a statue of a human being when they are older, and you don't hide their age, and you don't hide their faults, and you make sure people see their blemishes. You might even accent their blemishes. But the point is, the grandeur of a human being is not in some fake ideal where we chisel everyone to look like Adonis. It's this human being who has lived and suffered, and through living and suffering has come to know and appreciate and understand and have power. You see these portraits of Julius Caesar, which are amazing, but they're not quite flattering. And then there's some that are really not flattering at all, that are a bit crazy. There's a great one of a guy from Pompeii, and he's just warts and hideous. He's got this funny expression, but you know he loved it. But again, these portraits, if they're not directly about death, and now they're not, we get to have portraits of people when they're alive, they're still consumed with showing mortality, showing age, showing what we're like as we're nearing the grave. In many ways, oddly enough, the other innovation which allowed portraiture to exist of human beings while they were still alive, and not either A, directly commenting on their realistic features which showcase their mortality, or B, you just idealize them like a god. And I should say, sadly, verism as a school of portraiture disappears when the Roman Empire really gets started, because now everybody, beginning with the emperor, wants to be a god. But I would say the portraits of human beings as living, even if they might have been deceased, but portraits of human beings as living, where you were supposed to see them as alive, would be the icons of the early Christian church. Now, iconography is now associated with Eastern Orthodoxy. It's not the only branch of Christianity that has it, but is the branch where it's the most important. And obviously, icons always depict people who have passed on. They always depict saints that are no longer with us. At the same time, the point of the icon is to tell us they are living presences. They are people who will never disappear, who are actively intervening and interacting with this world right now as themselves. If you've ever looked at an icon, you'll know, of course, it is not a realistic depiction of anything, and it's not meant to be. It's meant to be, and again, this cliche for some people might make them shake their heads a bit because they've heard it forever, but it's a window on eternity. If we strip away some of what people might think is the hyperbole of that statement, I think it's pretty obvious what's being said here. The icon proper is allowing you to glimpse the human being fully alive. The icon proper is a portrait, which allows you to glimpse the human being as completely animated by the love of God. And so, I'm going to end this funny little talk, which was rougher than I expected, with just this interesting observation. Portrait, as a unique subject matter and genre of the visual arts, begins with death. It is a gift bequeathed to us by death. It's the gift of death. But portrait, as it develops, becomes that which is solely meant to remind us of the living and of eternal life.